Okay. Thank you very much, Cenk, and hello all together from my side. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation to give this speech on weather, climate variability, and mountain tourism. As Dan noted before, I will talk a little bit about, I will talk about winter tourism, but I try not only to talk about winter tourism, because mountain tourism is, of course, more than only winter tourism, but it seems to be that there is more literature and more knowledge on snow-based tourism than on summer tourism, at least in the context of weather and climate variability. What I'd like to talk about is to focus on the approaches we have, the methods that we can use to answer our research questions and to enhance the knowledge that we have, and to give an overview of the methods we have. Here just the headlines that we see every year in the media, of course. This is from the Daily Mail online, saying that there has been a bad season start for the winter ski season in Australia. Worst winter snowfalls in 50 years. You see that every year at some place in the world, in the southern and in the northern hemisphere. We had the same thing last year or last winter in the European Alps. And you can see that variability in this case, so snow-deficient winters and snow-abundant winters can potentially affect tourism in these regions. 2 years ago, there was a snow drought in the northern part of the European Alps that affected tourism negatively, but there were also abundant snowfalls in the southern part of the Alps, southern Austria, northern Italy, and they also complained about decline of tourism, overnight stays, because of the massive snowfalls. So either way, they seem to be affected negatively by extraordinary weather, climatic conditions. From a conceptual or system perspective, I assume all of you know that seminal paper of Laper. Climate and weather can affect actually every part of the tourism system. So on the left side, we have the source markets. Weather and climate can act as a push factor, as Dan said, that the Brits tended to look for the heat wave. So they were pushed away from home because the weather was not as good as they would like to have it in the summertime. It affects the destination. That would be a pull factor. So that, for example, would be the heat wave in Central Europe we had this year or this summer. But it can also affect the experience of the tourists in the destination if the weather is not as expected to be. And it can also affect the transit region of the tourists going from and to the tourism destination. In these cases, most of it is extraordinary weather events, natural hazards that actually worsen the accessibility of the tourism destinations. And this impact can lead to consequences in tourism behavior, destination image, and all these kind of things. And that's actually what we are doing research on. Another more detailed system perspective is the work of Chris DeFridas, where he looked at the different facets of tourism climate, so the physical, the aesthetic and thermal components of the tourism climate that affects the perception and, in the end, the behavioral adaptation of tourists to these climatic conditions. In the end, it affects the perception of climate in the destinations the tourists are seeking, with consequences for the availability or for the value of climatic resources in the destinations, for tourism, touristic planning, vacation timing of the tourists, the facility planning, so that's the destination view, the supply side, perception of climate and weather, and it's a criteria for predicting future demand, which is important or can be important for business planning purposes. I'd like to focus on these 5, I would say, categories of approaches that we can see in the literature on weather and climate. And the examples I will show are on mountain tourism, but of course you can use these approaches not only for mountain tourism, for any kind of tourism that's dealing with weather and climate. So we have the analogs, then statistical relationships, or you could say econometrics, supply-side modeling. Then we have surveys, interviews, and at the end I'd like to show you something about agent-based models. The analogs, we just had one this summer in Central Europe. We have these analogs. We have several examples for warm winters in mountainous areas around the world. And the interesting thing is that you can use these seasons to assess the potential impact of extraordinary weather, climatic conditions on touristic demand and on the touristic supply side. So if you have the data, you get the integrated effect of supply and demand side adaptations and behavior in that season. Here an example of the winter season in two areas in the US Northeast and Austria where there have been two very extraordinary seasons. So this was the warmest season ever recorded in the European Alps, and this is also one of the warmest seasons in the north of the US, above 3 to 4 degrees above the climatic average. That led to a reduction of snowfall by around 30 to 40%, so a remarkable reduction of snowfall. And in the end, that led to a shortening of the ski season of something like in between 7 and 11%. That is actually not that much because that's about 2 weeks shortening of the ski season that lasts about 4 months. So you can see that you would expect a higher impact on ski season length. We did not see that such a high impact because they have adapted and they could use snowmaking in these seasons. And the resulting impact on demand, on skier visits, the number of skiers going to the ski areas was modest compared to the impact of the temperature signal. So they only lost between 11 and 12% of skiers and consequently of revenues. So we see that they can adapt. They have an adaptive capacity to reduce the potential impacts of extraordinary weather situations on their business. So that's the upside of the approach, that we can see the integrated effects of supply side and demand side adaptation. But the downside is that we can actually not say what is the share of supply side adaptation to this adaptive capacity, and what's the share of the demand side adaptation, and what is the cost of the adaptation, especially for the supply side. They might have done something in that season, more snowmaking or whatever, or marketing, but we don't know what the share and what the cost of these measures were, and if they can afford to do it in a second year, if we have a series of 2 or 3 of such winter seasons. And of course, we do not know how the demand would react in the future. That is the demand reaction of one particular season, but we cannot tell if the potential demand reaction would be the same in 20 years or in a series of 2, 3, or 4 years. So that's you cannot do that with that approach. Another approach are the econometrics, so statistical relationships between several weather variables and tourism indicators, whatever indicator you use. Most of the studies use overnight stays because in many countries they are officially freely available. The downside is that overnight stays, in the best case, they are available on a monthly basis, which is nice, but which is not ideal for looking at relationship between weather and tourism demand. In some cases, some were able to use daily statistics, visitor statistics in ski areas or also in other tourism businesses, but the majority is about overnight stays. Here an example of a study that was conducted in Austria looking at summer weather conditions and overnight stays, and this study found that there is a significant statistical relationship between sunshine duration as well as temperature and overnight stays of domestic tourists in the same year. So the domestic tourists, the arrival or the overnight stays of domestic tourists increased in the warm summer season. And there was also a significant relationship between these variables and international tourists coming to Austria, but in the following year. Not in the warm year, but in the year afterwards. Altogether, the overall positive impact was not that big in absolute terms. A 1 degree increase in temperature led to a 1.1% increase of overnight stays. So you could see a positive effect, but it's actually very small. Another example from Switzerland. Here, a time series of 20 years was analyzed in the last 20 years, 2 decades. The impact of weather on overnight stays of domestic tourists in Switzerland. And here it was found that mainly tourists from population centers were attracted by destinations that were rather close, that have a rather close location to the population centers. So these destinations could benefit from hot temperatures, whereas other mountain destinations, being further away from the populations, they could not see any effect. So what I want to say with that is, when using these statistical relationships in econometrics, you have to consider space in your assessment, because if you would average that or if you would do that analysis for data from Switzerland, you might not see any effect, although there is a regional effect of weather or climate on tourism. And in fact, they interpreted these results that actually the population of the hot cities fled the heat on a weekend and went into the mountains on a Friday and went back home on Sunday. So they saw that the share of short stays increased in that summer season. So these destinations might benefit from hot summers, whereas these they did not see any effect. Another example from the winter season of the U.S. Northeast. Here the authors looked at the closure of ski areas. When you compare here, these black dots are the ski areas operating in the 1970s. On the right side, we have the number of ski areas operating 37 years later. So you can see that quite a lot of ski areas closed in this time period. And the authors looked at relationship between, again, weather variables and exit decision of the ski areas, and they found a significant impact of annual snowfall on the exit decision of ski areas. So when there was a year with low snowfall, then in the following year the share of, or the number of ski areas that had closed their operation increased. And the second thing they found is, not very surprising, that smaller ski areas had a higher risk of exit or closure than larger ski areas, because the larger ski areas have the financial capacity to invest into adaptation measures to balance climatic variability, for example, like snowmaking. I'd like to turn to supply-side modeling. I have two examples for supply-side modeling. I think we hear some examples also in this conference on that approach. For summer tourism, one example would be climate indices. Here the example is the Tourism Climate Index that was conducted for Europe in this example. What I would like to say is that at the moment I do not see a very remarkable progress to use this index for mountain tourism. Due to two main reasons. One reason is that actually the question is, how do you want to apply that index on the topography of an alpine area? I mean, this index is calculated on a, let's say, I would assume 50 by 50 kilometer grid. Even if you increase the spatial resolution, if you go to a 1 by 1 kilometer grid or so, you can calculate it, but how do you assess the climatic suitability of an alpine region for tourism? Do you take the base elevation of the valley? Do you take them a midpoint or a peak elevation? I think that's something, this is a problem you have to solve before applying such an indicator for mountain tourism. And the other thing is that it's actually, you cannot say that there is something like mountain tourism, even not in summertime, because we have a large number of tourism products in summer, and the climate preferences of tourists going there for different purposes and for different activities might have different climatic preferences. And that should also be included in an application of the TCI on mountainous tourism. Another example of supply-side modeling, and here we have quite a large body of literature that was started in around the 80s and has more or less exponentially increased in the last decade or 2 decades, is snow modeling combined with an assessment of an indicator called snow reliability. So the potential impact of climate change on the climatic resource snow for ski areas. And here an example of a study that we conducted in the Eastern Alps, so Austria and the surrounding regions in Germany, Switzerland and Italy. And here we see modeled snow reliability in all of these skiers in a 2-degree scenario considering snowmaking. in all ski areas, and you see that about 70% of these analyzed ski areas would be snow reliable with this indicator and with this methodology. So you cannot say what we read in the media every now and then, that there will be no skiing in the Alps in the next 20 or 30 years. So we cannot support that with the model results. But on the other hand, we see that there are quite some ski areas that could potentially drop out of the market being non-snow reliable, and they concentrate in certain regions around at the rim of the Alps, which is problematic in this case because up here we have Munich, here we have Vienna, so very big population centers with a high potential of skiers. And the question is, what will they do in case that these ski areas drop out of the market? Many people learn from the population centers, learn to ski in these ski areas. It's cheaper than going into the inner Alps. It's more easily accessible, and so on. And the question is if the total market would shrink due to a dropout of these ski areas. So that's an open question, but it could be that the potential impact is higher than only that we lose some rather small ski areas at the rim of the Alps. And the other question is, what is not displayed here is that yes, we included snowmaking, but the water demand or the demand for snowmaking will increase with a temperature increase. Of course, you have to produce more snow, you have more snow melt, and averaged overall, overall ski areas, a 2-degree increase would mean about a doubling of snowmaking demand. An increase of snowmaking costs, and the question is if all of these green ski areas being potentially snow reliable can afford to invest into snowmaking and cope with these increasing operating costs. And what I would like to stress here is that many of us in the past have been looking at 30-year means because we have kind of a climatological view of this topic. We're used to that. But for the tourists and for the stakeholders, I would say that 30-year means are not that important, at least not the stakeholders when you talk to them. Important are the extraordinary years and the extreme years. The bad years are important. If you can cope with a bad year, you're well off. If you can only cope with an average year, you might have a problem. And here displayed are the snowmaking hours on a monthly basis for a ski area. And you see that even in January, so the coldest month of the year, in a bad year, in the worst year, in a 30-year time period, the snowmaking hours are cut in half in this ski area. And in absolute numbers, 150 hours, that is not much. There are many ski areas who do not have the capacity to prepare their ski area with 150 hours of snowmaking. Not to speak of November, very important November for the starting of the season and the end of the season of March. So I think in the future it would be worth to look at extraordinary seasons and the impact of potential impact of extraordinary seasons rather than looking at 30-year means, at least for the application for tourists and for stakeholders. And to think about or to analyze the probability of such extreme seasons in the future. I know that it's difficult from a climatological point of view, but for application of our assessments, it would be very important to look at these changing probabilities. Another very important approach are surveys, tourist surveys. We have seen some examples before in the keynotes. What you can look at are, for example, temperature preferences, perceptions of tourists, how they perceive the climatic resources of a destination, and what their potential behavioral adaptation would be in case that non-ideal or non-acceptable weather situations would occur in the destination. And what I would like to stress here is that it was already said that there might be differences between different cultures or nationalities. If you look at beach tourism, here the perceived optimal temperatures differ between these three nationalities, between 25 and, let's say, 29 degrees. So there is a difference. And it could be if a destination decides to or tries to change their main source markets and attract other markets, that actually their climatic resource will also change. It might improve or it might become worse. For example, if you try to attract more guests from the Arabian region, suddenly in the Alps, rainfall might become an important climatic resource. And at the moment, it's not a very good resource. You do not want to have rain in the Alps. If you have some guests from the Arab regions, you might benefit from the rainy days. On the other hand, we see that there are remarkable differences between different tourism environments, comparing beach, urban, mountain tourism. So that's what I said before. We have different tourism products, and the climate preferences and the dependency on certain weather variables of these tourism environments or tourism products may differ significantly between these different environments. And we have to more deeply look into that. Here an example of a survey that was conducted in a mountain area in southern Germany, looking at temperature preferences. You see that these blue means that the majority, more than 50% of respondents, feel temperatures below 15 degrees as unacceptable, and the majority perceives temperatures above 30 degrees as unacceptable. And there's a certain range of ideal temperatures between 21 and 25. So these are interesting results, I would say, but the question now is how do we combine that with climate change? So if we know that climate would change by, let's say, 1 degree in the next 20 years, what would that mean for mountain tourism in this part of the Alps? The problem here is that in contrast to the winter season, where we have one very important climatic resource, snow. So if you do not have snow, you do not have skiing. So that must actually have an impact on demand. In the summertime, we do not have that clear threshold for any weather variable. It's very individual. There's a broad bandwidth, and the question is, what happens with a 1 degree increase, and how can you operationalize that in a model or in a future assessment of potential impacts? That needs to be done. Here another example of surveys being conducted in the winter season. Again, we have more literature on that worldwide. And in general, what all of these surveys actually look at are the alternative the tourists have if snow conditions are not as expected. There are actually basically three options they have. They can temporarily substitute their activity, they can spatially substitute it, or they can perform activity substitution, meaning activity substitution means they do not go skiing at all and they do something else. This means they just go somewhere else on the same day as originally planned, and temporal means they go skiing on another day and try to have as many ski days as in a normal season, so increase the skiing frequency. And when looking at the literature, we have some studies for Australia, Switzerland, Austria, and North America. You can see the good thing is that actually activity substitution, it's very low numbers, around 6% of respondents say I would do something else in the short term, but maybe also in the long term, I would stop skiing in the future. And actually this is the worst thing for the ski industry because that demand is lost at least in this particular season. But fortunately, the majority of respondents said, no, I still will ski, maybe at a different time of the season, or maybe at a different place. So from a market perspective or system perspective, that demand is not lost. The demand might be spatially redistributed, but it's not lost for the industry. And what I would also like to say is that if you compare these numbers, they're not, I mean, there's quite a broad range of these numbers, the share of respondents giving the answers, and that's due to the fact that actually you cannot compare these surveys because in part of it they ask different questions. The answers that were available for the respondents differed and so on, so it's very difficult to compare these surveys. The last approach I would like to show you is agent-based modeling. That's, I would say, it's a combination of the survey instrument and the modeling instrument, trying to simulate a redistribution of demand in a market. This is an example of Ontario, and the agent-based model actually simulates the behavior of the agent as defined in the model. In this case, the agents are tourists, ski tourists, and decision rules have to be defined in the agent-based model, and these decision rules are based on surveys conducted in this area where people were asked, what do you do when ski conditions are not ideal in this place? Where would you go, or what would you do? And I'd like to show you a short video. I'd really like to show you a short video how that looks like. Yeah, it's it's working. So we see these red dots are the ski areas, red if closed and green if opened. So we also included a snow model to simulate the ski season. And here you see the daily demand in that ski area, the simulated demand. So we see the peaks, that's the weekend peaks. We see the weekdays, we see some holiday effects. And we also see this bright blue up here. This is the demand that comes from closed ski areas on that particular day. That's when the people said, okay, if this ski area where I'm right now is closed, I would go to another ski area. And that's the spatial redistribution of demand. And I think these are quite some promising new innovative methods that are being used. And I hope that some more will come up in the future, also for summer tourism maybe. And on the final slide, I'd like to give you a short outlook of what I would wish for the future, or what I would hope for the future. I think there's a high potential of these methods. They've been improved in the last decades, and we have seen some remarkable improvements and developments. But I think there's a big chance to combine different approaches, as I've shown the survey combining with a modeling approach, with a physical and demand-side modeling approach. But you could also think about including econometrics in such models, or including interviews, qualitative interviews, and trying out some new approaches and combining them. And the other thing is that when looking at the literature and when reviewing papers, I think we have to remind ourselves that we have to think about the questions we ask. We have to ask the right questions to get reasonable answers, and we have to choose the right methods to answer these questions. And unfortunately, when you look at the literature, that's not always the case, but I'm optimistic for the future. But I think we should be more critical about the things we are doing and the things others do. But I hope this will be a very interesting conference. I'm really looking forward to the speeches we hear this afternoon and tomorrow. And I'm curious for your comments or questions. Thank you.